Hello. Welcome to the Deep and Durable Learning Podcast. This is the show for anyone who has struggled with the superficiality and short half-life of what passes for education. I'm Mike Gray, and I'm transitioning from nearly 45 years as a professor in higher education into this role of podcast host. Hundreds of my former students have told me that I taught them how to think. This show will offer my proven strategies that will enable you to make the most of your God-given potential to learn. I'll lead you through concrete steps that you, and your children if you're a parent, can take to make learning an exciting exploration of empowering ideas. Join me as we pursue deep and durable learning. This second season of the Deep and Durable Learning Podcast is all about how the brain learns. Today, we'll explore the central role of emotion in learning. The stereotype has emotion and reason in two separate compartments, but that's wrong. Reason is propelled by emotion. You may have heard someone say about a topic or an issue, "I don't know and I don't care." What they really mean is, I don't know because I don't care. Caring is essential to learning. Let me pique your curiosity today with a compelling question to illustrate. Here's the question. Why may the Omicron variant of COVID-19 be the best thing to happen so far in the COVID-19 pandemic? I bet most of you are curious about what's admittedly a contrarian view. Maybe you're even curious enough to wait until the end of the podcast for an answer. I hope so. Curiosity fuels the learner. Curiosity may have killed the cat, but curiosity, in fact, fuels learning. Curiosity exhibits itself at an early age as young children want answers to why questions. My just turned 4-year-old grandson, whom we're doing preschool for, wants to know why and is not satisfied with just what. Inquiring minds want to know not just what, but why. Questions, especially why questions, are attempts to explore, to make connections to other ideas, or to explore causality. By the way, while we're early in the topic of curiosity, and we're thinking about children, since I'm thinking about my grandson, I think I should say that you should not, even with a preschooler, structure a curriculum solely on the basis of a child's interests. That is, what they're curious about. If you do, you'll end up exploring matters of dubious significance. The tree of hyperlinks will include some rabbit trails. And rabbit trails are so named because for a hunting dog, they get the dog off the trail of the quarry the dog is really tracking. On the other hand, although you shouldn't structure a curriculum solely on the basis of a child's interests, you also should not ignore a child's interests. Rather, you should seek to use their interests as well as to create new interests by showing them why some areas that are currently off their radar are actually fascinating. We're exploring today what have sometimes been called epistemic emotions. When I say epistemic emotions, I hope you're making the connection with last season when we talked in some detail about epistemology. Epistemic emotions are emotions that catalyze the desire for learning. So let's start with the most obvious epistemic emotion. I've mentioned it already, curiosity. This season we're exploring how the brain learns and why how it learns matters. Curiosity engages part of the brainstem that's known as the reticular activating system, or the RAS. According to a standard reference work on the brain, the RAS, quote, performs a crucial role in maintaining behavioral arousal, consciousness, and motivation. The RAS ceases to maintain focus, our focus on learning, for instance, when we don't see the relevance of the learning task before us, or when we view it as trivial. We feel this when we feel our mind wandering, which occurs periodically as we check in and out of a lecture, for instance. It may even be happening to you right now. Brains are wired to look for changes that they should pay attention to. So if a presentation doesn't seem to be going anywhere, our brain looks elsewhere. Maybe there are more interesting things, more important things happening somewhere else. So the RAS, the reticular activating system, is important, but it's not the only emotional component of learning. In addition, we have something called the limbic, Limbic, the limbic system of the brain, which includes a group of structures that are involved in helping us care enough to pursue learning. There have been several important papers published just in the last couple of years on epistemic emotion. One was published in 2020, and I'm going to be referring to it periodically. It has a revealing title, and the title is Surprised, Curious, Confused: Epistemic Emotions and Knowledge Exploration. It was written by Vogel and co-workers in 2020, and it's a fairly long article. You can check out my accompanying blog post for this and any episode at deepanddurablelearning.com for references, links to this paper and other papers, and more detail on this and other issues raised in this podcast. I encourage you to go there to explore further issues that we raised today. So curiosity is basic to propel learning forward. And curiosity is created when there's a significant gap between what you know and what you want to know. It responds to the gap with what Vogel and co-workers call knowledge exploration. Maybe we could appropriate the warning that's posted and sometimes given audibly in the London Underground rail system, which is mind the gap. Of course, they're referring to the gap between the platform and the train car that you need to be aware of, because there's a hole that might cause you some difficulty if you don't step over it. Here, we could say that mind the gap is that your mind cares about gaps. Often the gap is revealed when we encounter the unexpected. An idea or data supporting an idea that we did not anticipate, or a turn in a narrative that surprises us, is usually motivating to exploration. Let's talk about another aspect then of the unexpected, and that is surprise. Quoting from Vogel and co-workers, surprise when learning something unexpected, curiosity when a question remains unanswered, and confusion after encountering contradictory information are typical examples of epistemic emotions. Epistemic emotions are major drivers of knowledge acquisition. Close quote. So since these are major drivers, we can't afford to ignore the emotional state that we're in or that learners in general are in. We in fact need to cultivate surprise, the unexpected, the recognition of knowledge gaps, and feed curiosity rather than table it. Unfortunately, in classrooms, sometimes the exact opposite is done. I'm remembering now a family friend whose high school-age daughter was censured by one of her teachers who said, "You ask too many questions." Now, as a teacher, I know sometimes questions can be used as a diversionary tactic, but in asking more about the kinds of questions this young lady was asking, they were sincere, related to the topic at hand, but not part of the curriculum of the day. Now, that might be excusable once in a while, that the teacher doesn't want to get off script, as it were, but as a regular pattern to squelch curiosity so that the script can move on uninterruptedly is missing the point of instruction. Rather, to take the question and move it in a direction that satisfies the questioner and that allows a richer linkage of what we know as a teacher is coming up later in our curricular plan for the day, could actually make this a much better learning experience than simply sticking to the script. So, when we're teaching or when we're trying to learn as learners, what we want to cultivate then are these knowledge gaps, which Vogel and company call cognitive incongruity. And let me quote here from them. Cognitive incongruity is produced when task information deviates from prior expectations or beliefs, or when task-related feedback indicates that one's beliefs are incorrect, especially if they're high confidence errors. Other incongruity-inducing scenarios include impasses and obstacles to goal attainment that involve contradictory information. Encountering contradictory information can interrupt the ongoing cognitive process, result in a reallocation of attention to the unexpected information, and potentially lead to exploration and enhanced processing of this information. Close quote. So, while it may at the moment be unwelcome, things that interrupt the cognitive flow when we've been taking something for granted, when we're sure our beliefs will be confirmed, when we have expectations, or we think we've heard this before, and then it takes an unexpected turn. Those are learning moments. Teachable moments are sometimes called, where if we care enough, if we're curious, we can use that as an opportunity to challenge, to question the degree to which we actually do understand something, and potentially enrich our minds or unseat a misconception that we have. So cognitive incongruity pulls us into the information in front of us, or maybe even the data in front of us, or into the argument a speaker is making. It may, at the minimum, lead to a quick check with Siri or Google, and is at least a start down the path of knowledge. Let me make a parallel, an analogy here. Cognitive incongruity begs for resolution. We should care enough that we want the incongruity to go away because we've resolved it, not just because we have ignored it. And the parallel here is with certain kinds of musical dissonance that need to be resolved. We're wired in a particular way that doesn't tolerate dissonance. I make no pretense of being a singer, but for the moment, ignore that, and I'll sing Happy Birthday to illustrate. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to... And your mind is probably filling in, you, why didn't you finish it? The need to resolve dissonance is something we feel. While the dissonance is unresolved, but moving toward resolution, we have a musical suspension. And let me defer to a musician who posts frequently on YouTube, whose name is Rick Beato. Let me have him explain this idea of a musical suspension.
Suspended chords are great to use when you want to have an emotional impact on the listener. I'll give you a great example. In the Jurassic Park theme that John Williams composed, he's going back and forth between B flat major and E flat major, and then he throws in an E flat suspended 4. Let's take a listen. When that E flat suspended 4 happens, he doesn't even do the resolution. Doesn't even put in that G there. So what's going on there is that the ear is hearing those A naturals each time, because that's in the key of B flat major. But the last time, the third time around the theme, and it goes F, B flat, up to A flat in the melody. That's called a downward modulation, because we're hearing, right? And then, so you're hearing, and that downward modulation with that suspended chord is really powerful. Listen to it again.
So much like we have very little tolerance for unresolved musical intervals, and we expect them to be resolved, typically, I think we need to create in the learning process a need that absolutely must resolve cognitive incongruity. Richard Feynman was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who sometimes called the great explainer because of his willingness and desire to help others, especially first-year students, to overcome cognitive incongruity with regard to issues in physics. And here's what Feynman said about this issue of cognitive incongruity and developing a sensitivity to it and a deep longing for cognitive incongruity to be resolved. Feynman says, quoting, "I believe that we should demand that people try in their own minds to obtain for themselves a more consistent picture of their own world, that they not permit themselves the luxury of having the brain cut in 4 pieces or 2 pieces even, and on one side they believe this, and on the other side they believe that, but never try to compare the 2 points of view. Because we have learned that by trying to put the points of view that we have in our head together and comparing one to the other, we make some progress in understanding and in appreciating where we are and what we are." Close quote. So in other words, we need to take confusion seriously and work to resolve it. We've all experienced confusion. There may be a variety of reasons for confusion that you've experienced, but one way in which confusion occurs is in the learning task when we encounter something novel that we never thought about before, or something complex that seems to be beyond what we can assimilate at the moment, or where there's a mismatch between what we thought we knew and what we're being presented with by way of new information or new data. And resolution is not immediately forthcoming. That should make us uncomfortable. Confusion can lead to a productive refocusing if the individual cares. And we're back to curiosity. This is normally resolved not just by filling in a fact, but by harmonizing ideas which on the surface seem to be in conflict, but are not really. Now, I'm aware that nobody enjoys confusion, and that prolonged confusion can lead to frustration. But as we grow as learners, we ought to develop a higher tolerance for not just confusion, but outright frustration. Frustration ought to be a driver. I don't like it, so I want to work through and get to the other side. Frankly, I view frustration for a mature learner as mental sweat that's produced by engagement with a cognitive task that's challenging, but not too challenging. That's, as one individual has said, just beyond our current ability. So we need to choose our learning tasks wisely and not expect too much too quickly. We'll get to that later on in the season. But we also ought to view frustration as mental sweat, as, in other words, inevitable if we have a sufficiently challenging mental task in front of us. Just like we're not surprised when physically we work out enough to produce sweat. In fact, no sweat as a statement indicates that there wasn't much going on of a challenge physically. No pain, no gain is more typical, and pain typically involves sweat. Athletes are not afraid of sweat. Many of you have personal fitness routines that regularly produce sweat. And so I'm just counseling here that we ought to develop both an intolerance for cognitive incongruity or cognitive dissonance that leads us to persist in the learning task until we get resolution, but to persist through confusion and sometimes outright frustration, and that ought to be an expected part of an appropriately challenging learning task. We don't want to go too far. If the resolution takes too much effort, or I don't know what my next moves should be, I acknowledge that frustration can lead to discouragement, which can then lead back to abandonment of the task. So just beyond our current ability, we keep getting stretched, but not completely overwhelmed. Well, let's circle back to the question that maybe you've been curious about since this episode started. The contrarian statement that the Omicron variant, let's state it as a question, why may the Omicron variant be the best thing to happen so far in the COVID-19 pandemic? Now, I'm recording this on December 31st, 2021. So by the time you hear it, we'll know more about the Omicron variant than we know right now. But I'm using this as an illustration. And I'm not saying that I necessarily agree, but this question brings into mind what may be a contrarian view, but has some logic behind it. So what we know, the little we know about the Omicron variant, is that looks like it has lower disease potency, lower virulence, we would say, in the professional vocabulary. That quite possibly that's true, that illness is not as severe. On the other hand, it appears that it's much more transmissible than, say, the Delta variant has been, and the Delta variant was more transmissible than the original strains of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. So it's, of all the variants out there, it's the one that's most readily transmitted from one individual to another. And there are reasons for that, some of which are known. The idea that the emergence of the Omicron variant may actually be a good thing, even the question says might be the best thing to happen, is that the position would be that for something with lower disease potency but more transmissibility may in fact become basically a universal infection that serves to, we could say in quotes, vaccinate the entire population of the earth in quick order. And this could generate the herd immunity that's been talked about sometimes. It essentially means that in many locales, the disease has very few or no susceptible individuals to spread to. So the infection burns itself out. It is important to realize that natural immunity from an infection is not permanent, just as we've found that the immunity from vaccination is not permanent. So viewing this as a way with smaller consequences in terms of disease potency to get more people in the non-susceptible category because of experiencing disease is the basis for why this could be a good thing. The obvious downside of having many more infections right now, double the number of infections per day in the U.S. that we had at the peak last winter. The downside of that is even if there's a much lower percentage of deaths, there'd probably be more total deaths than we would have had if Omicron had not appeared on the scene. And previous strains, at least, of the virus have disproportionately affected, with many deaths, those 65 and older. Well, time will tell if Omicron makes the pandemic better or worse. A mid-December 2021 University of Texas Austin study of Omicron transmission models showed it could be better than the pandemic course has gone so far, or it could be worse, or it could be about the same. So frankly, we don't know, but that's a curiosity question, and curiosity fuels learning. In 2 weeks, we'll explore the brain's marvelous capability as a pattern detecting device and a pattern making device. The human brain doesn't record events, and it doesn't do a very good job of storing and remembering facts. The process of conceptualization is what we'll be talking about in 2 weeks, and it's foundational to how the brain works. Unfortunately, educators often fail to focus on concepts to the detriment of lasting learning. See you in 2 weeks.